Welcome to the Professor Carol podcast. Join Professor Carol as she brings you cultural history like you've never experienced before. Visit ProfessorCarol.com and take advantage of any or all of the courses available to members in the Circle of Scholars. That's ProfessorCarol.com. Our Western culture is not an elective, it's a treasure.
Joining me is our professor, Professor Carol, and she is the musicologist, the expert who is helping us through this. America's Artistic Legacy. Thank you, Professor Carol.
Well, thank you for being here, Paul Bass. This is always fun, and I look forward to it every week.
Oh, as do I. Well, now we're getting into, you start out this session talking about World War I, and well, yes, I have to say World War I is kind of murky for me, and you bring about this point as well in this, and why is it hard to grasp?
Well, I think it's hard for all of us to grasp. First of all, we're not taught very much about it. I mean, I'm a post-World War II baby, so all we heard about, and rightly so, since our fathers had served in the Second World War, and it was, only our grandfathers or great-grandfathers, if we were fortunate enough, who could really attest to those years leading up to the First World War. So we entered it late, as you know, very late, and made a significant difference in the tide of the war. But all those years leading up to it, we were standing, and I think you could argue quite rightfully, on the sidelines. These were issues that didn't seem in any way to concern America. I don't know how you were taught it, Paul, but were you taught that the First World War was caused by the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand? Was that how you were taught at all in Sarajevo in 1914, sorry.
I have to admit, I know you mentioned that in the course, but I do not remember. It's been that long ago, and maybe we went over it so quickly that I don't remember that fact being in my history book.
Well, and even if it was, I remember learning it and thinking they did a whole world war because somebody assassinated some heir to the whatever throne. I remember thinking, that seems like an awful lot to do. I mean, I'm sorry he and his wife had were killed and everything, but bringing the entire world into war didn't make any sense to me as a student. Mm-hmm. And that's only one event, and it's so interesting. The more I'm really blessed with the chance to spend significant time in Eastern Europe these days, especially, and the more I'm around, the areas where a lot of these events took place, and listening to local people talk about history, and Europeans talk about World War I history much more than we do, because they see it as the first step on the way to everything that happened with the rise of Hitler, which it is, of course, and the whole disintegration of the 19th century stability of the monarchy and the various social orders that began to just blow up in everybody's face. So they see it as something not long ago, and not irrelevant at all, but still something they're debating and looking at. And what were the causes? What were the points in diplomacy? And there were many when this whole thing could have been called off and everybody could have gone home. Many. The issues were so, to most people, uncritical, nebulous, so on the upper echelon of politics and political diplomacy. Sorry about the Archduke, but everybody kept. Everybody went and had their appointed coffee and cappuccino time that very day in Vienna. I mean, I'm sure they mourned him, but he wasn't that popular, and the whole thing of the monarchy at that point was becoming less and less relevant to the average person in a place like Vienna or Budapest, where modernization and a modern industrial life was developing, and this old aristocracy seemed less and less vital to people. And so that in itself is not any reason the whole world came into conflagration. The whole Western world, we should say, even more than the Western world. Right. It is a difficult thing, and from our American perspective, it was a very hard sell to bring us into the war, a very hard sell. And Wilson campaigned, his second term, that he would keep us out of the war. I mean, that was what everybody thought would happen, and then it didn't.
So, we keep repeating history. I see that in campaigns in my lifetime. The war. One candidate says the war is good. One candidate says the war is bad. And by whichever one gets elected, depending on what they say, and then half the time it flips.
Yep.
The guy who said it's bad, ends up keeping us in war or taking us to war. So I do remember, that it seemed the one thing that I took away was that this poverty seemed to be something that the results of World War I and the poverty and the unrest ended up, like you said, the rise of Hitler and another world war came after that. And my grandfather actually fought in both. So
Yikes.
yeah.
So you really did get some family tradition in that, whereas I didn't have, my father fought in the Second World War, but I didn't have grandfathers around to tell me, and they were immigrant or they weren't involved. So, but you're exactly right. The aftermath of World War I is something we tend to be taught, although we don't necessarily grasp it. But Europe left, the Germans left with massive amounts of their territory, especially the Ruhrgebiet, the industrial area where the coal mines were, so needed to rebuild the country. A lot of that land was given away, was taken out of the country. The incredible war reparations that were required of the German, the Axis powers, as we would call them, it's the wrong war, but as the central powers of against which we were fighting, they were left in just such abysmal poverty and inflation. I bet you've seen those caricatures that show people with wheelbarrows full of money to get enough to buy a loaf of bread. And we did kind of learn that lesson. That's one of the times I really think people did learn a lesson about the necessity to rebuild after this massive destruction. And I think we learned that lesson in the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. I think that is one of the rare times when people, and I mean rare, people have taken the right message from a horrible situation and tried not to repeat it.
Yeah. One of the things that I've learned recently, you hear people saying buy gold, buy silver, and then another guy says this, but during that time, you literally could give a bucket of gold for a loaf of bread. I mean, gold still, as much as we say that it goes up in price, what was worth more was grain and food. So I'm thinking a food bank would be good for somebody to invest in as well. So
yeah,
I don't know. Yeah. Here's my advice: diversify. Don't just get a bunch of gold bars, because then you're going to be spending those gold bars. If something like this happens again, you're going to be spending them to buy a loaf of bread.
Yeah, so put the pinto beans and the dried fish, in there too. No, yeah. and we seem to think we're so far away from all that, and the people, in the 19-teens, this is a very modern world, and we try to bring that out in this class session. Everybody who teaches this era does. You've got automobiles, you've got the beginning of airplanes. We're not flying the ocean yet, but air power is a factor in the first war, although we look at it as very primitively, but they didn't see it that way. You've got telephones, you've got telegraph, you've got electricity, you've got streetcars running up and down, you've got a commercial mass culture that is built, and the last thing people could have envisioned in a city like Berlin, which is gorgeous and modern and full of theater and opera, and is that they'd all be scraping the dirt trying to find anything to eat within a few years. It's unfathomable in that modern world that was Europe.
Yes, and I just watched the recent Muppet movie this weekend, and they go to the Berlin Theater and they play. So I just have to tell you that tied it in.
You get your movies in always, don't you? The Muppet movie. Now, I haven't seen that, but I bet a lot of our families have. So I need to catch up on that one. I'm so sorry I haven't got to that yet, but I will.
It's cool to see the Muppets going places that Professor Carroll took me, Professor Carroll and Hank took me there before Kermit went there.
Oh, right. I know. I'm glad we're really quite focused in. This is important.
Yes, it is important stuff, yes. No, okay, so two things. How did we end up going over there, our military over there, but then how did, as I understand, you have to change the sentiment of the common man for wanting to be over there or even being concerned about what's going on over there. So how did those two things happen?
Well, the diplomacy and you could either argue a legislative or a backdoor dealing that gets us into the war is very complicated, and I invite all of our interested parties to read just about every book you can, because it did not. The average person sitting around the dinner table in Kansas or in Florida or in New Hampshire was not saying, we really need to get into that war and make a difference. That's just not where the common man was. You're exactly right. So there needed to be, when we entered the war, there needed to be a massive flip in the popular mass cultural understanding of the war. And that's where, once again, the arts come into play. Arts convey power, the power to communicate and to sway. And in this case, there was the poster art. Suddenly there were posters everywhere showing the ruddy-faced American Midwest boy, eagerly signed up. Yet, I mean, that stage of war that we see over and over, where off they go, and of course that's the state of war that, or mentality that the soldiers from Britain had been in, and Germany, and they had all seen themselves going off, as our Civil War soldiers did, for a month's lark to war. Only everything that had remotely made war somehow possibly honorable in the consciousness of the people was gone in this war. And by, very quickly, within months, certainly those British and German and Russian and everybody soldiers were in the trenches, seeing the most horrific destruction by poisonous gas, and early tank warfare, and the trench warfare, which was just horrible for people, and the devastation and the brutalization of casualties on a level no one had seen. And we all knew this back in America. So, getting everybody on board was not easy. And in our lesson, we talk about this one song. Now, it's not the only thing that happened by any means. There had to be incentives. Clearly, the industrial complex geared up. There were more jobs. It was very good for the economy. War is, if you win, is usually, can be helpful for the economy. It's one of those horrible facts, of life. But boy, this George M. Cohan song, Over There, over there, for the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming. That one song coming out of Tin Pan Alley from a composer who was going to become a big patriotic, I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy, and the Grand Old Flag, all these things that would be part of his artistic output, which was phenomenal. That one song, though, Over There, is as responsible for changing the mentality of our populace as any other individual thing could ever be. And I think it's a great example of the power of a single song.
Where do you think that this song in particular, did it come strictly from him, or was, what I'm saying, this can be considered propaganda in a sense?
Yeah, well, what's propaganda? It's spreading a message you wish to spread. But remember, he's a songster. He's one of those song-plugging kind of guys at Tin Pan Alley, and, he's writing a hit song. I mean, he doesn't, you think of the opposite of, I'm trying to think, in the 60s, the Blowing in the Wind, or any of those songs that had the opposite, and there are quite a few of them, as you know, in the 60s, in the anti-Vietnam era. Those songsters, I'm sure the people that wrote them had a sentiment behind them, but they also had a commercial eye, and don't think they didn't. And George M. Cohan, he was a Tin Pan Alley successful guy with great melodies and great lyrics. Sometimes he worked with lyricists, sometimes he didn't. But he had a hit on his hands, and immediately player piano rolls and sheet music. And we don't have talkie movies yet, but gramophone recordings, everywhere. This is a big, suddenly it's coming out of all the windows and people are whistling it on the, I mean, it's pretty irrepressible, the music that came out of that era, almost all of it. You hear it once and you're going, da 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 da. I mean, it just doesn't go out of your head.
Right.
And so, I never had a conversation with the man about what was really going on, but don't think that any of these people aren't aware of the bottom line, because you sort of have to be as an artist. So it's a very rich and interesting and very specific thing, but I think it tells a lot about the power of the arts.
Yeah.
And timing. Timing has to be exact in the arts for something to sweep the popular culture.
Very good. Yes, definitely. I mean, you get the feel, and you see how much music like this has played a part in not just politics, but in the movement of the country in general. Wow. And one of the things that I like about where we're coming right now in America's artistic legacy is the evolution, if you will, of things that are still available now. We're going into Broadway. We're talking about Broadway, and it's still a huge force today. So, we're not just studying something with grainy photographs and pictures. We're going to look at those, but you can go there today, and it's striving. It's thriving. It's thriving. So,
well, some days it's thriving, and some shows are striving, and some are thriving.
Right. The people are striving to become a part of it. So talk a little bit about that and how it came about and just what a difference it made.
Well, there's another one of your big questions, you and your seminar questions. But it's really true. Although Broadway doesn't have the role, the bottom line of this whole story is that once film really comes in, first silent film and then talkies, Broadway will become, and live theater will stay very, very popular, and still is in some respects. For example, depending on where you all live, you may have like here in the Dallas Metroplex area, Dallas-Fort Worth, we have musicals that come in the summers, and we have traveling versions of Broadway shows, and they bring Lion King and Mary Poppins and Aladdin and all these other things come through. But they're not inexpensive, and they're not here for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time. So it becomes, alas, a very special opportunity to see these large shows, which hadn't yet quite developed, by the way, but we're gathering the ingredients together for them. But we're talking now at a time where everybody's going to the theater the way we go to movies or watch movies, and people are just thirsty for more and new and glitzier and more excitement, and it is happening precisely in this area, Broadway, this long street, the theater district, which goes back really to the 19th century, but gets so much more kicked up at the end of the 19th and the early 20th with some of the establishment of theaters that are still there. The big one, the one that we love so dearly, is the new Amsterdam Theater. In 1903 it was built, very large theater for the time. And it will ultimately be the home of the Ziegfeld Follies, and it will go through its, and we're talking about that more in next week's class in the assignments, but it's still part of this story. It will be a thriving theater until all theaters begin collapsing in the Depression, and they have a terrible fate. Most of them in the post-war era, they fall into disuse. They are torn down. They this is a little bit off what you were saying, but I think theaters have a life too. It's like a plant. It has a life. It's born, it thrives, nobody waters it, and it dies, or else somebody waters it at the last minute and it survives, you see. And that's the case of the New Amsterdam Theater, which it's amazing it didn't get torn down. This gorgeous and opulent a structure that just dazzles one from the inside, and most of them were like that, And in this case, of course, it was saved by several people, the most prominent name being Michael Eisner of Disney, who got in there and was moved to tears to see this beautiful thing nearly crumbling, and was able to put millions of dollars in and reconstruct it and open it again with first some specific performances, and then screenings and things, and then with The Lion King, which ran for years and years and years, and then that was followed by Mary Poppins, and I believe now that's been followed by Aladdin, and that's a long way to come, because now we're talking about something you can go get tickets for today. But that's precisely the point you made. This is something that is being born, that is going to influence generations. It's going to have a low point, and now, it's gotten very chic again. It's very hard even to get tickets to Broadway.
Yeah. Wow. I don't know anything about Rockefeller Center, okay? But we were talking a little bit before we went on the air, and, I grew up in Miami, okay? And Miami is a place where a lot of these people retired. I don't know if that still happens today, but me as a child, I could be going and walking in the grocery store. I do remember one time my father saying, "Well, that's the that guy over there," kind of pointing and whispering. He used to play such and such, that I had no idea, what it was, some sort of theater. And but then there was a sweet little old lady that started coming to our church, that my mother met at a grocery store, invited her to the church. She knew nothing of church, and her name was Loretta. and she called the pastor the MC, the Master of Ceremonies. And as we got to know her, we found out she was someone who was a dancer on Broadway, but she was a rockette. And it's just such an interesting life that she had. She, all of this, but she lived in poverty. And it was so sad to see these people who were successful in a sense during that time, during a boom time, but here in the 1970s, there in Miami, living in a small trailer and with very little means to survive, but such a history there. So that's just a little personal story, but I would like to know a little bit of that history. What sets Rockefeller Center and apart from something like Broadway and the theater that you mentioned.
Well, that's a great story, and now repeat that by thousands of people, thousands of did you say Loretta? I forget.
Loretta, yes.
Loretta, right. There would have been thousands of Lorettas and everybody else's, Williams and Roberts and Marys, who have been part of this boom period, really. But the arts have never been a stable living. It's you have a level of glamour when you're on stage, or when you're at the when you have an opening of a show if you're an artist, or when you're playing in the pit if you're an oboist or whatever. It's not glamorous in the pit, but you're there, and it's so intense and it's so rewarding and it's so exciting. But the fact is, paying the bills and paying something which we all call retirement savings now, and that's a very recent concept too. I mean, people didn't talk about their retirement IRAs, or their funds, their money market funds, or their pension plans. I mean, that's all very modern and 20th century, still going to develop for many industries, certainly not for the arts. There's not musicians unions and dancers unions and all these things that have developed. And so there's everything you've just invoked in this story of Loretta. I mean, it is the fact that these people came, they were young, they were talented, and people got training back then. All those tap dance lessons and ballet lessons and piano lessons. The people that crowded to New York to be in the shows of the Ziegfeld Follies, which is really where this dancing that the Rockettes will do, starting in the late 20s and 30s, it's really going to be developed in these early Broadway shows, and it really goes back to the can-can in Paris. And you remember da 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 dum bum ba da 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 da, and I won't flop my skirt up, and try to kick my leg, but we've all seen this. But that's really the style. Think how scandalous. Oh my goodness, nobody even had skirts hardly off the ground, and here are these girls in the cabaret, with their garters and their whoop woo. That's really where that gets started in Paris, of course, not Kansas, Paris, but yet so that style of dancing will hit Broadway, and of course it'll become very formalized, very trained, very disciplined, the high kicking that we know from the Rockettes. But that's going to be in the Follies, that's going to be in the early revues, the shows that are in the 19-teens. This precision kicking, precision dancing is very difficult, has to be rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed. And of course you could take it back to ballet, where you've got what is the corps de ballet? It's complete precision dancing. It's complete, to Tchaikovsky perhaps instead of to the can-can, but it's still that incredible corps, ballet corps or dance corps. Everything is just to the everything has to be synchronized to a level that's almost inhuman, and that's so. To answer your real question, the Rockettes themselves, they really started around 1925, not in New York. They were actually in Kansas, if I'm not mistaken, speaking of Kansas. Oh, no, I'm sorry, they were in Missouri. I made a note about that, in case you asked me. Missouri. But then they came to New York and were brought, and they had a couple different names, and they were in different shows. And then when your Rockefeller Center opens, in the early 30s, and that becomes their new home, and they start these traditions to this day. And I hope everybody gets a chance to go see the shows, because even though they've modernized in many ways, it's still the same kind of spectacle. And I understand that there may be one or two, I think there's 2 dances they do still that come back from those original days where they made their mark. But what was the life of a Rockette? How many years could you do, 3, 4, even 5 shows a day, and during holiday seasons? How long could you keep that up? How long could you afford to stay in New York? What happens? Then you marry somebody, or you go off, and then your family's already probably disowned you because you went to New York. Because remember, Paul, this stuff was scandalous. To go on the stage for women has long been, and in some quarters still is, scandalous.
Hmm.
So you lose your family support, you know, honey, you're the one that wanted to get on the train and go to New York, and you've made your bed, now lie in it. You know, that would have been the prevailing sentiment, and it would not be an easy life after your time as a Rockette. What do you do when you're 40?
Right. Yeah, your career is so short, especially for the women, you know, especially, I mean, look at how, like you said, how physically demanding that is. How long can you continue to do that so much? So then you have so much of your life ahead of you, you know, to live on those earnings, you know, or to find something else to do. And what an interesting period. I mean, who are some of the superstars back then? You mentioned Irene and Vernon Castle.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I had to do that in this unit. I could have not done it, but I couldn't bear not to do it, you know. And I'll tell you why I love them so much. First of all, they are among our, and this is, you know, we have such interest in dance again because Dancing with the Stars. I'm so glad that's happened. Actually, I don't think I've ever actually watched it. Oh, I shouldn't tell that. Maybe I've seen 5 minutes of it or on YouTube or something.
That makes two of us.
That makes two of us. So you've seen 5 minutes too. All right, we're in then, aren't we? But see what they've done is they brought back a sense of the excitement of what had, you know, if you and I had been alive then, Paul, any young person was learning these dances. You know, the foxtrot and the tango. All these things have been made just the way kids learn the apps now and the video games. You know, find me a kid who can't download an app. Well, back then everybody learned the dances, and they did it for decades, and that had been true for centuries. Young people learned the trendy dances, and that was it, and everybody learned it, and you were judged socially on it. You know, your whole fashion and style was based on the newest dance. It's just an electric thing, and I think we see a reflection of it only with the Dancing with the Stars. You see these people who are, you know, seriously training on a level that most of us can't envision. This was something everybody did, and if you were allowed to get out of the house to do it, you know, it was a little scandalous. But okay, so Vernon and Irene Castle is very sad in a way. He was actually a pilot in the war, and I believe he was a pilot, yes, and he was in the war. He was British citizen, and she was American, and he died after the war, 1918 though. I think it was after the, I'm trying to remember, it was before or after the end of the hostilities. At what point? I should look these things up, shouldn't I? But the point is, he dies many, many years before she did. She carried on. They had already become superstars. They had set up dance schools, the Castle Walk, it was called. And one of the reasons I love all this is that my mother, of course, would have grown up years after Vernon's death, but still under the influence of the fashions of that period, because Irene Castle stayed a real superstar herself. Everybody had enormous sympathy for her, and I remember my mother talking about doing the Castle Walk when she, you know, and I had no idea what she was talking about, you know, of course. I usually didn't, but just like you, I was getting firsthand recollections and firsthand passing down for traditions from someone who had been a young girl and then a young teenager when all of this was and then a teenager when all this is still full blown. And so I think in the assignment we have everyone going to watch some old film clips of Vernon and Irene Castle. I think you'll be utterly charmed by them. Everybody else was at the time.
Wow.
So that's one, and of course you have all the Ziegfeld Follies people, and the Follies is just the topic. I love to teach about it, I love to talk about it, lecture about it, partly because I didn't learn about it formally in any of my music education. You know, we didn't learn this stuff when I came up. We got our Mozart and our Haydn and our Palestrina and our Puccini and our Beethoven. Nobody was talking about this American artistic legacy that was the popular mass cultural entertainment that is just as valid as the European popular mass cultural entertainment. But I didn't know that for decades and decades. That's one reason I do this course.
Well, I didn't know who Ziegfeld was. So,
well,
tell me a little bit.
Yeah, he wasn't in your textbook either, was he?
Yeah. No, I mean, Ziegfeld.
Ziegfeld. It's hard to say because we want to say Ziegfeld and it's
right. I want to say Ziegfeld. Yes.
Florence. He lived by Flo Ziegfeld. Florence. He was a charming man, as many a lady would have attested. And he had his great loves in his life. The first one being Anna Held, and the second one being Billy Burke, and many others on the side, I have to say, but his Billy Burke, whom we all know is the Good Witch, Wizard of Oz, in the Judy Garland Wizard of Oz, because she had a massive career and stayed in the films for decades. Think how, if you go Google how many films Billy Burke made, starting out, in the reviews, but then marrying, and because after you married, you didn't do this stuff. Even if you were married to a showman, you still didn't. You could appear some, but your days of being on stage like that were over. Happily so, probably. But Billy Burke was a great star, and she was one of the few who could keep on reinventing herself and being a star in movies like The Wizard of Oz, but many, many, many others. But she was back from that era.
Well, okay. There've been I'm sorry. I wrote down a note here. And how have the Follies? How did they influence our culture?
Well, and that's one of the reasons they ought to be taught. Seriously, it's one thing to learn about like Will Rogers or Bert Lahr or Fanny Brice, one of my favorite. Again, a lot of these people went from the Folly stages in the teens when radio started. If they were comedians. Now dancing on radio doesn't have the greatest effect. But if they were singers, if they were dancers, if they were singers, if they were comedians, as many of them were, like Eddie Cantor was a great dancer and singer, but he was also very funny, in his comedy routines, and Will Rogers, of course, and Fanny Brice, who could sing Secondhand Rose and all these tunes, but she was hysterical. She went on, had a great career in radio as Baby Snooks, and she did this for years and years and appeared on variety shows, and that's where I need to answer your question. What we got from the Follies was a mix of the same things that made minstrelsy so vibrant, which would be the songs, the dances, the comedy routines, the tricks. Then you have the vaudeville era where the personalities really take over, and you'd have these groups, these like the four Cohans, and you had these different family groups and singing and dancing families, and tremendous sophistication of the dance routines and the songs so popular by the Tin Pan Alley people. And then you put it on stage at the Ziegfeld Follies when you add all the glamour and the costumes. The costumes for the Follies are just incredible contractions, and we still see this in the great sets of the musicals from the 1930s, especially those big MGM musicals, where they're all in the swimming pool doing the dances, or with the big mirrored effects up on the walls, with the Rockette style stuff, and you can look up and see these symmetrical patterns and the great costumes, and the great lady descending the stairs with the French poodle with the feathers, and all of this comes. The Follies are where a lot of this stuff got worked out, and boy, every dime went back into those productions. Ziegfeld didn't make it. Well, they spent some money on the way. Don't think they didn't. But it's not like this stuff all got banked and put away for the future and for the grandchildren. It's just not how it worked. It was live for the day, live for the next production, get through the next production, start the new Follies for 1918, 1919, 1920. Every year was a new extravaganza. It's a little bit like our NFL seasons. Well, okay, that was over. Now we got to win the Super Bowl next year. It's got a lot in common with the way we treat professional sports today in terms of the glitz and the money and the constant thinking about the now. It was a great era, and it has influenced us. Every time you turn on late TV on Saturday night, every time you still see remnants of this. In the movies, we see remnants of this. It hasn't left us.
Well,
Ooh, that was.
yeah.
I got to learn shorter sentences, Paul. We're not getting there. You need to help me. You need to help me.
Well, I think we could go on for quite some time, but I think we can just let everybody know that the course is there, and there's so much there. Are there good biographies about some of these families? That intrigues me. So many homeschoolers are members on ProfessorCarroll.com, and you've been to homeschool conferences sharing what you do. A large part of what you do for homeschool families, and I kind of think of that because there are a lot of homeschool families who are keeping the arts going, and I think of these vaudevillian families who play music together and practice so many long hours, and are there good biographies about some of these families?
Well, I think you made a wonderful point that when you let people get into a setting which many homeschool families manage heroically and at great sacrifice to create, where you take away the external, a lot of the external distractions of modern society, modern culture, the things that keep us from focusing on artistic expression and on family connections. And we know that there's lots of things that do. When you take that away, people's natural, God-given creativity just comes out. And it's the kind of things our children love to do. They like to put on plays for us. Here, Mommy, look at this. Mommy, well, this is the ultimate Mommy, look at this. Because, when these families come together and somebody plays the ukulele, Paul, and somebody plays, I wonder who that could be in your family, and somebody sings, and somebody is clever with gymnastics, and somebody else can get the dog to do the craziest things you've ever seen, like balance a tray on its head and walk on two legs, and somebody else, can make up songs, and suddenly you've got an act. And that's precisely how these things sprouted up. And of course, a lot of people do it within church music, and they put together gospel choirs, they put together singing groups, and they're writing their own hymns, and this is so exciting. I think, in a way, reading the biographies isn't as exciting as watching it all happen right before our eyes once again in these families that so wonderfully are doing this. But one of the things we want to start doing is adding more bibliographic listings. People do ask us to write. I got several questions today asking about good translations of Pushkin short stories. So we haven't listed as much of a reading list on ProfessorCarroll.com as we're going to be on our Circle of Scholars. There are a lot, though, and I think you can take any. The only thing I would say, and I have to say this more and more, artists don't live neat and tidy lives always. So for those people who are choosing biographies for their children, older students who would be able to read, good biographies at this point, you always have to remember that you're getting into the lives that were difficult and complicated, and oftentimes it's very, I think, wise to investigate a little bit before you do hand the biographies to your younger kids. That's always a good thing to do as a parent. Check it out first. I know our parents do that.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Well, I can tell you really love this period.
Can you?
And you're starting, and you're getting to the part where I really like it too. Just while you're talking, it's like I actually miss some of this stuff when I'm thinking about it. I started out watching the Lawrence Welk show, and then went on to, there were so many of these family groups. We had the Donnie and Marie Osmond. We had the Osmonds on TV. We had you mentioned in the course of Michael Jackson, the Jackson 5, the Jacksons on TV, and even Barbara Mandrell and her sisters. There were so many of these families that, it continued on into the 70s, and it just seemed to die out somewhere around the early 80s. And man, I miss it. So I'm sitting here reminiscing, I guess. But I appreciate you hearing it. Like you said, we could talk about this for a long time. It's just so rich, and
but the thing you love so much is going to wreck it all, Paul. You know that. You are the advocate of the very thing that's going to take it all down.
Yeah,
you know what I'm talking about, don't you?
I do. And
the film industry is going to just take it all down. First, the silent film, and we're going to be working. We have as much time as we can afford to devote to some of the great stars of the silent film. That. And then when the talkies come in, who can compete with that? Who can do it?
Yeah, and that is an interesting.
It's all your fault.
Yes, yeah, I had a lot to do with it. Oh, well, thank you so much for sharing with us today, and for those of you who are listening live, thank you for joining us. And if you're listening, watching it on YouTube or listening later on, just remember, go to ProfessorCarroll.com. Join the Circle of Scholars. Try it out for your whole family. I mean, just one membership gets everybody in, and we just love to see more of you there. And there's just so much more of this. We can't even sit and talk about it. But it has been a great time. Thank you, Professor Carroll.
Thank you, Paul. You're always fun to visit with, and we hope everyone enjoys exploring all of this material, which, thanks to the marvelous historical clips that are very widely available, really can come alive for our families.
Right. So, all right. We'll see you guys next time.
See you next time.
Thank you for joining us for the Professor Carroll podcast. Remember to visit ProfessorCarroll.com. Along with classes, you'll find live webinars, on-location video updates, and more.